Thank you for being on, Steve, today. I really appreciate it from both myself and the subscribers. We've really dug into your material, the Saretsky report, and I think it's interesting to see the whole big picture. So, if you wouldn't mind right now, if you could give the big picture of real estate and what you see today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I think everyone's fairly well aware that housing markets national or globally are booming. Obviously, I think as part of this whole, every asset class is running higher right now. But I think particularly in Canada, what's interesting is I had this conversation yesterday. So everybody in the media I watch a lot of these guys in the U.S. as they're talking about U.S. home prices, growth is off the charts. I think they were saying like the Case-Shiller index is up, 13% year over year, and they're going nuts. But nationally here in Canada, the home price index, which is equivalent to the Case-Shiller, is up 23% year over year as of April, and I think that as we get more of the data coming out, we'll probably see price appreciation on a national level hovering in around 25%. So yeah, it's record price acceleration ever. We've never seen this kind of price appreciation. It surpasses the previous boom we had in 2016, 2017. So we do have record home prices, and it's really not just so much concentrated in Vancouver and Toronto like it kind of was in the past. We're seeing price appreciation, obviously, fastest acceleration in places like Ottawa, New Brunswick, Montreal. You're even seeing some lift in Calgary and Edmonton, where prices have been pretty beat up over the last 10 years. So really as a national level, yeah, it's just been a frenzy. And I would say a lot of it's driven by easy monetary policy, loose credit, but also just human emotions, people moving for various reasons due to an unprecedented, obviously, pandemic.
So that brings me to the obvious question, and that's about interest rates. So we're looking at record low interest rates, we're looking at record low mortgage rates, and I just want to know what you think, number one, about sort of the state that we're in and how that relates to interest rates, but also the future of interest rates. If they rise, what do you see happening?
Yeah, I mean, obviously in Canada, it's a 5-year fixed mortgage, which is what most people are doing. Obviously, it shouldn't be a secret that if rates start to rise and people have to renew in 5 years instead of 2% that you're borrowing at today, it's 4%. Then of course I mean, if you start looking at the payments, it's not a drastic change in the payments, just because I mean 4% is still low. But I think what's important to distinguish is that consumer spending in Canada is 65% of GDP. So obviously, if you're you know issuing more of your payments into your debt servicing of your mortgage, that's probably going to pull back on consumer spending. And so that's going to slow the economy as a whole in general, right? So I think that's where the distinction needs to be made. I don't have a personal view that rates are going to skyrocket to anything out of control. I just think because at the end of the day, it's like, if you look at this, I mean, Canada's debt to GDP, I think, is over 350%. So, and that's almost like on a global scale as well. It's very similar. You basically have this society where everybody is levered to the gills, right? You've got governments running massive deficits, which are all predicated on low borrowing costs. You've got corporations that are extremely levered, and then you've got households, particularly in Canada, which are extremely levered. So I think any sort of normalization in interest rates, I think, tips the entire global financial system, in my opinion. But
So that, of course, was my next question. And we're talking about a catalyst or a financial crisis. Do you think that it is interest rates that is ultimately something that will be possibly what brings these housing prices down? Or do you think it's simply too much debt, it's not enough spending, or it's something that comes from, I talk about it all the time. It's called the China credit impulse. And that is basically, a reduction of spending elsewhere in the world that sort of comes around and maybe has an impact on places like Canada.
yeah, I mean, I think that's a very important distinction to make, and everybody, I'll be the first to admit, like, I'll tell everybody, like, it's not going to come, there's not going to be a correction in Canada that comes from the government saying, hey, you know what, enough is enough, let's just kill this thing. I think since Q1 of 2018, like residential investment, I think has resulted in almost 50% of nominal GDP growth. So it's like housing basically has been driving the growth in the economy over the last couple of years. So no government's going to kill that willingly. What's going to happen is if we ever do get a correction of any decent size here in Canada, it will come from a global event that will be out of our control, right? It could, yeah, like you said, it could come from China. It could come from some sort of mishap in the bond market over in Europe. I don't know what that is, but it'll be something where there's some sort of credit crunch or turmoil in the bond markets on somewhere else in the globe, and that basically funnels through here into Canada. And that's where your problems arise. It's not going to come from some sort of policy intervention where they just decide to let's just shoot house prices by 25% and create some affordability. No government is going to get reelected on that policy. So again, in my opinion, it will be an external event.
Absolutely. You see it all the time, how much determination they have to continue these bubbles as far as they can take them. It's unbelievable. And that leads me to something else here because you look around not just to Vancouver, Toronto, and all these other Canadian cities, but also to New York and San Francisco and Miami and other places where the prices have accelerated to such a degree that it becomes unaffordable for a lot of people. And do you think it could be a lot like we see in Europe or Japan or other places where a lot of people are simply renting permanently? Is that something that could actually happen to cities like these really expensive cities today?
To be honest, I mean, personally, it's always hard to predict the future. And like the reality is nobody knows. I feel like we're certainly going down that path. Like if we continue to run these policies, which I think policymakers are going to do everything they can to maintain the existing financial system. And so I feel like obviously if we continue to go down this path, I think that's inevitable. You're going to see home ownership rates continue to drop off and you almost become like a renter class. I mean, I look at stuff that's happening in the US, for example, you're seeing massive corporations now are buying up single family housing. And so, you've got like, I think it's companies like Open Door, you've got companies like Zillow, Redfin, they've all got these are publicly traded companies with enormous amounts of equity that again are buying up single family homes to rent out. So to me, like that's a concerning phenomenon that is, I mean, obviously it's not here in Canada yet, but I just feel like that is kind of the way we're going. I mean, I can speak specifically in Vancouver. It is a global market in Vancouver, whether you like that or not. And I do feel for the working class, because I think if you're like just a, whatever, policeman, a firefighter, just a hardworking individual and you're trying to earn enough after-tax dollars to basically save up for a down payment to get into the housing market. Like, meanwhile, you're competing with people, let's say from Hong Kong, that earn higher salaries, that, pay very little to no income taxes on their salaries over there. And then they just bring a wad of cash over here and they plunk it down as basically a store of value, as a hedge to basically get their money out of there and into Vancouver. Like, it's just extremely hard to compete with that. And there doesn't necessarily seem to be any, again, policymakers that really want to change that, because I think the system is bigger than one individual.
One of the questions that we had submitted from the subscribers was to ask about Vancouver versus other markets. And there also was the question of, looking at places like Vancouver, but how the prices are more elevated there than other places around BC. And if you had any insight to talk about that specifically.
Well, I mean, I think what I find interesting is that, like, obviously Vancouver is where like the wealthy money wants to be. And then what happens is you have people that have been in this housing market now for, they bought their house 30 years ago and they decide to cash out. Well, where do they go? They go to the island. And then that pushes up the prices in the island. And then, so what's interesting, because I've had these conversations with, developers and realtors in various cities across BC, is so if you're in Vancouver and you cash out, everybody in Victoria complains about the people in Vancouver coming and pushing up the prices. Now, if you go to Nanaimo, everybody complains about the people in Victoria coming to Nanaimo and pushing up the prices. And it's the same thing. People in, Kelowna complain about the people from Vancouver pushing up the prices. So this money basically just like circulates around the province. And so, yeah, I mean, it's all just sort of one large, sort of, I guess, I don't know what you would call it, like a liquidity that just pummels around the entire province. And I'm sure it's probably a similar thing in Ontario where you are as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So, one of the things that I tried to talk about in my book, and I've talked about on the channel for the over the years, is how do we determine what exactly is overvalued or undervalued? And that goes for any asset, but in this case here for real estate. So there's different ratios, of course, we can apply. But what are the ones that you like to look at to really determine, like, not just based on price, because I think that's short-sighted in some ways, but how are we looking at necessarily, the overvalued or undervalued assets? What would you use to determine that?
To be honest, I think it's a hard one to sort of put a finger on. I just think that markets are so distorted now, um, from all levels of government and policymakers. Like obviously, again, you look at the central banks when you push basically rates to zero or real negative rates. It's like, what's the value of an asset? It's almost unlimited in some circumstances. I'm not saying that's the case for Vancouver, but I mean, one of the ones I will look at personally and say, well, I mean, what's the equivalent to rent? So I actually think that there's a pretty good, I don't know what you call it, like a hedge, or there's almost like a pretty good arbitrage is the word, where you can. So, for example, in Vancouver, you could go and buy, a house on the west side of Vancouver, detached single family house. Obviously, that supply every year continues to shrink because we don't have any room to build out. People need to understand that there's no more room, so we're only building up. So every year, the number of houses for sale continues to shrink. But anyways, if you go and buy a house on the west side of Vancouver for $3 million, that's obviously a lot of money. You can probably rent that house. I know you can. You can rent that house for probably $5,000 a month. So if you start looking at it and say, well, $3 million house, I probably need to put close to $1 million down. And your mortgage will still come in around $8,000 a month, plus taxes, et cetera, and the opportunity cost of having $1 million tied up. So you're really actually paying a premium to own here. Like it actually is cheaper to rent in Vancouver than to own by many metrics. Obviously, most people are looking at it again as a store of value, capital appreciation. So, and I think what happens is you have a lot of families that say, well, we want the security of home ownership, knowing that, our landlord can't just sell one day and we got to move again. So that's really, people are paying a premium to own in Vancouver. I think that's important to distinguish. But I would also want to add is, one of the things that I think gets really hyped up in the media that is actually very wrong is people keep saying, oh, house prices to income, house prices to income. And even for me, I used to talk about it, but the more you actually sit here and work like I do day to day in the field, you see that most people, or not most, but a lot of people that are buying today aren't buying with incomes, right? They're buying, they've earned their incomes elsewhere globally, or they're already on the housing ladder and they're leveraging that equity, or there's some sort of wealth transfer from the parents. So like nobody's using their incomes. And then when I look at it even further, like, again, there's a lot of wealthy money in Vancouver. A lot of them are business owners and earning money through corporations and stuff. So they're not declaring like very high salaries. So and one of the places you can certainly point to that as I grew up in Richmond, which is kind of the mecca of Chinese money. These individuals, I think Richmond has like the lowest income in the lower mainland. It's because nobody actually earns an income to buy a $2.5 million house in Richmond. So I think that's the one thing to understand.
That actually is, this is working out great because it's exactly what I want to talk about right now. Because a lot of the people in the subscribers have asked, and over the years we talked about this before, but foreign investors, there are certain I've seen certain numbers coming out there. It's 30%, it's 13%, and I think it's more difficult to determine the exact percentage. But do you think that's part of the reason why we've seen, so much of an influx of cash at a time when wages have remained stagnant, or I would argue actually in real terms have declined in a lot of these places? Do you think that's part of it?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a big driver. I mean, the problem is like, you get all these PhDs that come out and try to crunch these numbers and use the data and say, well, foreign ownership's only 4% of the market or whatever, which means it should only move the prices X amounts. Like, the reality is like we do have a lot of influence in that market. Particularly, you can see it just flooding in 2015, 16. That was kind of what's got the party started for the next leg higher. Um, I think the biggest thing to distinguish is that, and people have made this argument, and it is true. It's not necessarily that it's like foreign ownership where it's like, hey, this person like is not Canadian. He's coming from whatever, China, Iran, whatever. Um, the biggest thing is that a lot of them that are buying, they have permanent residency status. Or they have their Canadian citizen, they have dual citizenship. So it's almost like I don't want to call it immigration problem, but it is like it's hard to tackle because we're putting in a foreign buyers tax, and now we saw in Canada that the government's announcing a 1% annual foreign buyers tax to underutilized homes. It doesn't really capture it because a lot of the foreign money, what happens is you get someone that again earns their income, makes a lot of money over in Hong Kong, but they're a dual citizen, so they come here and they plug their money here. It's like they're not going to pay a foreign buyer's tax because they're not technically a foreigner.
Exactly.
So yes, I do think that plays a large role. Particularly, we see a lot of it in the pre-sale construction. So a lot of the big high-rise concrete towers. Particularly downtown Vancouver, where you're paying $2,000 plus per square foot. You do see a lot of offshore money is basically absorbing that supply.
Okay. And you talked about it already, and it's something that I had covered recently on my channel was the institutional money. And I'm wondering how much of that is playing into the single family homes. That market there, obviously, there's only so much availability in particular areas. People, they say, I want my children to go to school at this school here. So, of course, there's only a select number of homes available, based on what they want. They want to live in more desirable, sought after neighborhoods and this and that. But I'm wondering, if you have any insight as to the institutional money behind this.
Would you say institutional money in terms of like pension funds and stuff like that?
Anything really. Because you get a lot of the insight coming from, it's people that really want to buy homes and people and people and people. But I wonder how much of that is actually coming from these real big establishments coming in, whether you had mentioned it before. I can't remember the name now, but essentially how they've been buying up
Absorbing.
all kinds. Yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. No, I will say like we don't have any like corporations coming in and absorbing single family homes. And those home buying corporations like they have in the US, that are buying single family homes at scale and renting them out. It's not a thing in Canada yet. And I think part of the problem is in Vancouver. Like again, I mentioned it earlier, is that okay, you look at it. Let's say Redfin comes in and says, "Hey, let's buy a." What are they going to do? Buy a house in Vancouver for $3 million and rent it out for $5,000? Like, I mean, I suppose, but it's just, and it's hard. I think like what I'm seeing from those corporations in the US is they're going in and they're buying these like, um, in the mid Southwest, they're buying into these subdivisions where you've got thousands of homes and all those homes are basically identical. They all cost $400,000 and you know what they're going to rent for. Like the problem is here in Vancouver, it's like every single house is so unique. We don't have like massive subdivisions that were all built in the same era that they're all the same price. Like in Vancouver, the housing stock is very unique, and so I don't necessarily think we're going to get that sort of corporate buying at any time soon. But yeah, like I said, I think what you do see, particularly the single family houses, is it's a lot of locals that are already in the market, or they're getting help from parents, or you get a lot of the offshore money as well coming in and just buying it up because they want their kids to go to UBC or something.
Right. Now, one of the questions from the subscribers was to, are there any tips that people can have if they're looking into buying a home right now, whether they're, in Vancouver, anywhere around, just some tips that you can offer to people to sort of help them out at this time when obviously things are getting very expensive.
Yeah, I mean, I just think that it's important to understand that, you know, a lot of the information, particularly in Canada, right? Like we've been on basically a 30-year housing bull market. Um, I think that people have only seen one direction, which is up, and we get a lot of our information from like our parents, right? They say, "Oh, hey, well, I got on the housing ladder 30 years ago, and look how it worked out for us." And we just wrote down obviously bond yields to zero. I think it's important to understand that's not the same environment anymore. Like, so if you're taking your parents' advice, I don't know if that's necessarily like the bulletproof way to that's going to translate to the same success over the next 30 years. So I don't know. One of my thoughts is, again, I think like unfortunately the reality is it is a different world, and I think that a lot of people are going to be renting. If you have to rent, like let's say you want to live in the city of Vancouver, like maybe you should just go and rent a 2-bedroom condo, and maybe you can buy an investment property to somewhere else out in the suburbs, or in Alberta or whatever, or even in the US, where at least, okay, you might be paying rent where you live, which whatever, that kind of sucks, but at least you're collecting rent somewhere else where maybe the numbers make a little bit more sense. I don't know, that's just like my opinion of just like an arbitrage. But again, or again, you just you start small and you get into the market somewhere else out in the suburbs. But I think the reality is these global cities, I think, are becoming basically luxury items that you almost have to be asset rich to basically get into them.
Unbelievable. Well, one more question I wanted to ask was submitted by one of the subscribers. Was if somebody's looking to become a real estate agent or in this field at all, or do you have any tips for them? Just concerns or tips or strategies or anything?
Uh, well, I mean, I think that I would definitely say, like, of course, it can be lucrative, especially when you're in a big bull market here. But it's extremely competitive. I think. Again, I know where you're at there. In the province of Ontario, I believe that they have more realtors than they do school teachers. So there's a lot of realtors, and the competition is extremely tough. So it's important to understand that, in my opinion, it's similar to running and operating any business. Like the first 2 to 3 years are going to be tough. They're going to be lean years. But so you're gonna have to fight through that. I would say for anyone that's getting started, probably the easiest way, to be honest, is just to join a successful team, someone that can kind of mentor you and give you some business and while you sort of grow your own client base. Because if you think about real estate, it is a long sales cycle. Like I'll meet somebody for coffee, and then a year and a half later they buy a home, right? So it's not somewhere. It's just a long sales cycle. It's a big investment decision, but that's pretty much what I'd say to anyone looking to get started.
Nice, very nice. Thank you very much for your time today. If people want to find you, where was the best place that they can do so?
Got my YouTube channel here, so I think you just search Steve Saretsky, and then also pretty active on Twitter as well, at Steve Saretsky. So those are probably the two best ways to sort of connect with me.
Thank you very much for myself and my subscribers. I want to thank you for coming in today, and hopefully we can do a follow-up 6 months, a year from now, and see if anything has changed.
Yeah, that sounds good, man. Thanks for having me on.
All right, take care.